Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Please excuse the seriousness of the title. Emergency episode just had a nice ring to it, and it is something that we are interjecting into our normal schedule. This isn't a Tuesday takedown. It doesn't make sense for secular Bible study series. I didn't want to hold on to it till Sunday. This video from Gavin Ortlund with Truth Unites just came out yesterday. I just saw it, and I wanted to make an instant response to it because one of my biggest issues, as you all know, is the immorality of this God via things like biblical slavery. It is one of the most unjustifiable and inexcusable things in the Bible, and yet apologist after apologist after apologist continues to try to find a way to do so. Gavin used a few clips from both of my slavery videos seen here to respond to, alongside Alex O'Connor, Stephen Woodford, and Sam Harris, which was nice to be in such good company. And I wanted to make an immediate response video, although it will not cover all 70 minutes of Gavin's video. I'm going to take a look at a few of the arguments in the middle, especially the ones that he's utilizing around my videos, about the difference between indentured servitude and chattel slavery, how the chattel slavery of, say, the transatlantic slave trade is not what we see in the biblical account, and how atheists like myself are oftentimes too cynical and skeptical and making too big of a deal out of what we read in the Bible about the slavery that is regulated by this God. All that to say, Gavin was kind. He was thoughtful. He stated where he could see the perspective difference in the verses, but ultimately disagrees and stated his disagreement. I think, though, that those disagreements still fall short, and I will try to handle my rebuttal to him in the same grace that he gave me. That being said, Gavin, I would love to have a conversation with you on this topic if you would like to do so after this video. So, emergency episode on biblical slavery. Here we go. The first thing that I want to do is just help you understand very quickly what I believe Gavin's video was about for the first 30 minutes, because I'm not really replying to anything that happened in those first 30 minutes. And I just want to lay out the foundation for you. And I'm going to do so by, I've watched it, but I'm going to do so by talking about his chapters here. So he starts by showing the atheist critiques. So he shows clips from myself, from Sam, from Stephen, and from Alex, and he's showing the weight of it. And I think that he's kind of given it as a call to Christians to not ignore these hard topics in the Bible and that they should be able to have an account for it, which I think is wonderful advice. He talks about the dangers on both sides of the aisle, Christians who just glamorize the Bible and can often run away with it in a positive direction, and then also the ability, especially for atheists, to look too skeptically or see too sinisterly aspects of the Bible and let that muddy the waters, so to speak. And I do want to say one thing to this point. Both of them are equally incorrect if there was a truth that is real in the middle. But the reason that atheists, I think, bring up, or I'll speak for myself here, the issue with slavery in the Bible is because of the claims of this perfect, all-loving, all-just, benevolent God. I do not deny that there are beautiful things in the Bible. I do not deny that certain aspects of the religion are even beneficial. So what then is my excuse when I make such a big deal out of slavery? Am I just cherry picking those verses? No, I'm showing a contradiction against what is claimed for the nature of God himself. And I wouldn't even go all the way to say this disproves the Bible. I think that when you have a God that is so mutually exclusive, it should definitely lead towards evidence that maybe this God doesn't exist in the way that is described. But it could just be as simple as, okay, if this God exists, maybe he's not as moral. Maybe I don't agree with his morals. Maybe he's not consistent. Maybe he's hypocritical. All those things could be true of a God. There's nothing inherent about a God that means perfection, except, again, in this God's claims of perfect justice, perfect love, perfect truth, etc. That is why I make such a big deal out of it. And I've made this analogy before, but I think that it's fitting to understand and hopefully to help Gavin understand why this is such an issue. And I don't mean to be too bombastic here. I'm not trying to be unnecessarily blasphemous. I just think it is a good example. If a new neighbor moves in next door and I happen to know that this neighbor is a sex offender, if everyone else in the neighborhood is telling me how great of a guy this guy is, how he came over and helped and mowed their lawn or shoveled their driveway, how he taught their kid how to throw a ball, how he gave them a ride when they didn't have one and even helped get them a job or gave them some money when they were down on their luck, it doesn't mean I should let my kid go be babysat by this man. I am not being overly sinister or skeptical or critical by hanging on to the one fact that we do know about him, that he is a known sex offender. That is an important piece of information, even if there are many other good facts about him, that should give anyone cause for pause. And that is the exact same kind of thing that I'm talking about when I point out any moral issue in the Bible, be it genocide or slavery or commanded rape or anything like this. He then goes on to describe slavery in the ancient world. And this is something that I think I have yet to see see any apologist not do. A lot of what I would wrap up as the theme of his video is not so much that the Bible doesn't condone slavery, just that it regulated it better than anyone else, that it made new and improved laws that improved the life of some of these servants or slaves better than anything else in the ancient Near East or the southern Levant. And fine, I'm not going to argue that slavery has not existed everywhere for the most part for most of history. It has. Having a better form of that does not all of a sudden make this God perfect. It makes him within his time and place, or slightly ahead, if these claims are even true. And we're going to be getting into that here in a second. The other very common thing, and Gavin does it here too, is to talk about the creation account being made in the image of God, pointing to that as proof of the inherent dignity that each and every person that God creates should enjoy, and thus reflecting God's view on all people being equal. But what that is doing is it is extrapolating an idea from a verse about being made in the image of God and denying the rest of what Scripture has said about the differences between, say, the fact that some people are going to be slaves for their entire life, while other people enjoy freedom from a biblical standpoint. The abomination of being a homosexual versus not being one, according to the Bible. The lesser value of women, etc. And I don't want to open a new can of worms for Gavin to have to respond to everything, but I do think that when there is so much evidence of different levels of worth, even Jew and Gentile, for instance, in the Bible, pointing back to a more open verse about man being created in the image of God, does not solve the problem for me. His next main segment is on context, and this is fair. This should be called out for believer and non-believer. Context matters. Many things that I've heard atheists argue are simply not true. They do not understand the context, or they are not willing to deal with it, and they continue to make the same false claims over and over that are just simply disbeneficial. Christians, of course, do this as well. So I will endeavor to do my best in responding to Gavin's claims today to make sure that we are in the right context and explaining where I'm coming from. His fourth chapter starts with servanthood in the Old Testament, and that is where we're going to be starting our rebuttal here today. Around the 30-minute mark, he points out a clip from myself and responds to that. I'm going to play a little bit of that, and then we will hop back in.
Mindshift put out another video responding to Trent Horn. Trent Horn was pointing out that the Atlantic slave trade was evil, and here's how Mindshift responded.
Now, I think in many cases throughout human history, slavery was unjust, like the transatlantic slave trade, for example.
So he just said it. The transatlantic slave was unjust. That is exactly to a T what the Israelites were doing. They're not taking from within their own country. They're going to a different country or tribe or people group or ethnic group, etc. They're going outside of their own area to take people and make them slaves as property. It's the exact same thing. How can anyone excuse that? It's like they just do the same thing. Every single apologist does the same thing. They hear the verse in Leviticus that is definitely not about indentured servitude, and then they say, let's talk about indentured servitude. It's cheap.
So there he's talking about Leviticus 25. We'll get to that passage in a minute. But here I just want to push back against this claim that the transatlantic slave trade is the same as slavery in the Old Testament to a T. No, it wasn't. I think any honest historian would admit that, first of all, just in its scale and brutality, it was sort of unrivaled. But more basically, it's a different kind of slavery altogether. Just taking the prohibition of Exodus 21:16 alone, this would have made the transatlantic slave trade impossible, because in the Old Testament, you get the death penalty for human theft. It doesn't say whoever steals a Hebrew. It says whoever steals a man.
Okay, so we're going to stop it here and handle these first two remarks back. My case stated was that many Christians who excuse the slavery in the Bible will say that the transatlantic slave trade was corrupt, that it is incorrect, that it is evil. So I point out that it is exactly what we have, this chattel kind of slavery in the Old Testament for the Israelites in relation to non-Israelites. Again, there is a ton of conversation that needs to happen around understanding the difference between how an Israelite was supposed to treat an indentured servant for the 6 or 7 years that they have them, and how they could treat slaves from other nations. The first thing that Gavin pushes back on is that no, it's not the same, because it's not as bad in terms of the scale or wickedness. It was a smaller population doing this to another smaller population. Does that change at all what the sin is or the evil? If I say Joe murdered 15 innocent people, and that's wrong. And he did so in the exact same fashion as James did when James murdered 100 people. Would it make sense to come back and say, whoa, these two things are not alike? James murdered way more people, and he did so with a knife, not a gun, which seems more brutal. No, they're both murdering innocent people. If you want to squabble over what weapon was used or how many people were murdered, we can definitely talk about those differences, but it does not excuse Joe. So that argument is completely flat. But on to his more serious defense. He brings up Exodus 21:16, which he quotes, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." He says that it doesn't say whoever steals a Hebrew. So he's making the distinction that this is for everyone. This isn't just about Israelite to Israelite with indentured servants. This is a prohibition against stealing people, and thus it cannot be like the transatlantic slave trade. There's two ways that we can tackle this. First of all, let's do so biblically by looking at Exodus 21 in greater context. And it starts, again, let's look at the context here, verse 2. "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go free." That is a Hebrew. That is not the same kind of thing that we're talking about in Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. It continues to talk about rules for your Hebrew servants all the way up through verse 11. At verse 12, we get into a new category of personal injury. And then in verse 16, we get anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So there is an argument to be made that this is just continuing down the list of how to treat Hebrew servants. But let's give Gavin and the Bible the benefit of the doubt and say that all of a sudden it switched to be talking about people in general. But what do we know about the slaves that were able to be bought from foreign nations? They're owned outright as property. Kidnapping someone is very different than purchasing someone. Now, to help make this case, I think it's time we read Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves, not kidnap them. You're allowed to buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelite ruthlessly." Let's remember that verse for later, but it is even making a distinction between the foreigners you buy and your indentured Hebrew servants. And so if we go back to Exodus 21, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. What this looks like very plainly to me is you go to a foreign nation and you buy your slaves, you own them as property, you have a deed to that person forever as property to be able to pass down as inheritance. If someone steals your property, it's punishable by death. That's it. That's actually protecting the master's right to the deed of their slave. If anyone out there is making the case that chattel slavery happens is only via kidnapping, it's incorrect. In America, and what we're seeing here in the Bible, you could purchase slaves that came from other nations. In both cases, if someone unlawfully took your property from you, they were punished. So far, I'm seeing 2 for 2 in the connection between American chattel slavery and ancient Israelites being able to buy people and own them. I don't think this verse does for him what he believes it to be doing.
Now, in his response to Trent, Mindshift was saying that, masters could treat servants however they wanted. They could beat them, they could rape them, all these kinds of things.
Yes, were there Israelites in the Israelite community that ran out of money and were going to starve? And so they said, hey, because I have no other option and you guys are into this thing, let me come work for you for 7 years. And that would almost be okay if it was a work contract. But the things that were allowed to happen to these individuals, you could beat your indentured servants as long as they got up the next day. You could totally mess them up as long as you didn't dismember their body. You could rape them. You could force them to do anything you wanted to. Very, very few rules, and you got to do that for 7 years.
But this is clearly wrong. Just from what we've seen in Exodus 21 alone, we see, no, slaves did have rights. Think of Job's awareness. If I mistreat, even when they bring a complaint to me, how will I deal with God if I mistreat them? It's not so sinister. People try to make this worse than it is. Here's another example. In cases where a slave is killed or assaulted by their master, there are severe penalties. So earlier in Exodus 21, 1, you find, I'll just read it. It says, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. The Hebrew word for avenged here is talking about the death penalty. And again, that's rare in that historical context. But here's the problem. People look at verse 21 and say, oh, how terrible. You mean you can beat them as much as you want, and as long as they survive, then there's no punishment. It's false to derive from Exodus 21:21, oh, because you don't get the death penalty, there's no penalty at all. But it's really easy to misread these passages or to make them a little more sinister.
Okay, so a few things to reply to here. He's saying that I'm simply making it too sinister. One of the things he does is point to Job, and Job does have an excerpt where he's talking about how he's concerned that he might be accountable to God for if his slaves or servants were to come to him saying, you've treated me poorly, and he does nothing about it. Great. This is anecdotal. Job predates the law that is given from God. All this says to me is Job on his own was more righteous as a man with how he treated his workers than this God would be, which God proves by killing his workers unnecessarily by being provoked by the Satan. Then later, God lays down these laws, and that's what we should be taking as what God thinks about this, not what one man thought who was trying to worship this God. But first he says that what I said is clearly wrong because of what we saw in Exodus 21 alone, about the eye and the tooth. But that is exactly why I said, as long as you don't dismember parts of them, you were allowed to beat them, because this is the only prohibition we get, and it's hyper-specific. It doesn't say treat them as you would treat yourself. It doesn't say make sure no harm comes to them. It doesn't say anything that would be more broad and general that would show us a part of care. You can't pluck out their eye or pluck out their tooth. That's it. And we know that you can do worse because of the verse that Gavin states for us here at the end. And he quotes back to Exodus 21, verse 20, anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. What does this give express permission to do? Beat your slaves. You are punished only for the tooth or the eye, but otherwise, beat them as much as you want unless they die, in which case you're going to get in trouble. Is it slightly better than some of the other nations around them? Yes, which is the point Gavin keeps trying to come back to. But to say that you could not beat them or treat them terribly is simply not true, right? This is how you know that the eye and the tooth thing isn't really some coverall for any doing bad. Otherwise, this verse would be unnecessary. This verse is exactly saying, yes, you can beat them. Don't let them die. I really don't understand how Gavin is missing this. I really don't. I'm not making this stuff up. I didn't write these verses myself. I'm not taking them out of context. It's right here. And the funny thing is he's using the verses to try to establish the opposite, and it's just not the case. Now, he's about to get into Leviticus 25:44 through 46, which is where I believe we actually get to chattel slavery. We actually get past the indentured servitude of the chosen people group. But before we leave Exodus 21 behind, I've never, no matter how many apologists go through Exodus 21 to try to defend chattel slavery, even though it shouldn't be connected, I've never heard one of them bring up the verse at the beginning here. Here it is. I think this might be the most impossible thing to defend. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, okay? So we're talking about indentured servitude. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. Great, the year of Jubilee, that was a good deal for people that owed money. You work for 7 years and then you're done. By the way, I'm being sarcastic. It's a horrible deal. No one would want to do it, but I could understand it in so much as a society like that existed at that time. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judge. He shall take him to the door at the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. And Gavin, this would be the kind of thing where I would love a reply from you, because I think it was glossed over, which you also accused many atheists of glossing over, the positive parts. The indentured servant, the obvious Hebrew servant who is paying off his work debt, which you find permissible. If the master gives him a wife, which seems like a trap in the context of how this works, and whether they just stay married and don't have kids, or whether they have kids, which 7 years is a long time. We're talking about people's lives here. They want love, they want children, they do it even when they're in this debt economy. This means a couple things. A woman does not have the same rights as the man. She is just eternally the master's. So much for inherent dignity from Genesis 1. And 2, that child, male or female, is born into slavery for life. Make it make sense. How is that good? Would you be okay with this today? All of the excuses about why indentured servitude was important because of the time and the place and the context, because there were no other governmental fail-safes and all of the things that even Gavin alluded to at the beginning, they don't apply to that next generation. Should that baby not have the right to grow up free and try not to incur his own debts? This is collective and generational punishment to the nth degree. This is just within indentured servitude alone. 100%. There's no getting around it. If we can't even make excuses for making this just, I don't know how we're going to do it for chattel slavery. But Gavin's going to try. The next clip here is him talking about Leviticus 25.
This is one of the passages that Mindshift is talking about. It's talking about the distinction here between Israelite servants and foreign servants. And the language here, and in other passages as well, for acquiring is not talking about human theft. That's already been forbidden in Exodus 21. It doesn't even have to mean acquiring through money. The verb here doesn't have to mean a financial purchase. You can find this same Hebrew verb being used for when a pregnant woman has a child and then she says, I have acquired a child. It's definitely not talking about a forced capture, man stealing, that kind of stuff. So the way that Mindshift took that is, again, more sinister than necessary.
No, it's not. Do you think that everyone who acquired an African as a slave during the transatlantic slave situation kidnapped this individual? Do you think they all hopped on a boat and went over there and sneakily took people? No. These people, on their own accord, on their own continent, many were born into slavery, many were made slaves, and then brought to the Americas to be sold. And many of the slave owners, who we would condemn as evil for owning another person for life and passing them down as property, did no more than go and acquire a slave. Tell me, how do you think it worked? He's even saying it doesn't have to mean that they bought them. What, were they gifted a slave? Does that make it better? I don't understand this argument. I'll concede 100%. Let's just go ahead and say no slave was ever kidnapped because of this prohibition in Exodus 21. Somehow, there were indeed already slaves in these other nations. You may go and do what? Buy slaves from the neighbors around you. That meant that there was a group of people that you could buy and a group of people that you couldn't buy. So you go and you acquire, you buy, you were gifted, you come upon whatever it is that you're trying to allude to here that you think makes this a stark difference. And you now own another human being forever as property. Is the only defense here that they weren't kidnapped, so it's not a big deal. That's insane. I'm sorry. I do not mean to be rude. It seems like the most immoral justification ever. Tell me in what context it works to somehow get another human being to be your property for life. I don't care what the financial situation was or what exchange was for what. Maybe you traded a donkey for them. Maybe it was a barter. Great. It wasn't a kidnap. So what? I'm not making it more sinister than it is. That's sinister.
Now, if you want to know for sure that Leviticus 25 is not talking about race-based chattel slavery, just keep reading. Right after those verses, you see the exact opposite scenario can come about. If the sojourner becomes wealthy, the Israelite can sell himself into servanthood to that person. I'll just read it for us. Leviticus 25, 47, 48. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. Actually, many of the commentators use this verse to show that foreign slaves could become free. They could work their way to independence, because that's disputed. But the point is, slavery in the Old Testament is not chattel slavery.
We simply don't get that from the text. Yes, immediately following verse 46, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly, making a distinction. 47 says, if a foreigner, not the foreigner that was a slave, if a foreigner, because that happens. People come into your nation as foreigners. That's different than the foreigner you purchased at the slave auction. If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich and any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to the foreigner or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them. All this means is back to the indentured servitude. You can even sell yourself to a foreigner if they happen to have enough money to work off your debt. It has nothing to do with chastising the idea of chattel slavery. It's just another rule for a different situation. It's frustrating for me to watch these kinds of defenses because without stopping someone word for word and saying, but what about this? But what about this? But what about this? They can just talk themselves into kind of this, it's not the same. It's not that bad. But I'm going to stop it. I'm going to be annoying. I'm going to interject a few times here. Let's do this really quick.
It's not rooted in racism. People say that too.
Okay, maybe people say that. That's not at all what chattel slavery is. You don't have to be racist for chattel slavery to have occurred. There were kind plantation owners that treated their slaves well, that even saw them as worthy of a certain amount of respect. Not racist. Still owned them. Like, it's so silly.
It's true that there is preference given for fellow Israelites, but the differences between an Israelite and a non-Israelite are not just about race. It's about their whole citizenship and nationality.
It's not just about race, it's about citizenship and nationality. And there was a preference given to Israelites over foreigners. Again, this is a nothing statement. Believe it or not, there were white slaves during the American slave trade, working right alongside Africans that had been bought. Does that mean those Africans had not been bought just because a white person fell into some financial trouble and ended up a slave or servant right alongside them? No.
But the differences are not absolute. The main difference seems to be with the Jubilee year principle. So every 7 years, Deuteronomy 15 says, you send your servants away, you don't send them away empty-handed. That seems to be applying to Hebrew servants specifically, not foreign servants. But that doesn't mean that foreign servants or foreign slaves could never be freed.
No, it doesn't mean that. Just like in the transatlantic slave situation, some of these people were freed by their masters. It was a personal choice by the masters, or other circumstances would come about where a freeman from the north would come and buy them just to set them free. It doesn't mean it's not chattel slavery just because they can get out of it. But on the books, only the Israelites, only the Hebrew servants had the year of Jubilee to look forward to, not the foreigners bought as slaves for life from other nations. Just because someone amends that rule and says, yeah, you're supposed to be mine for life, but someone paid me enough money, or I happen to like you enough, I'm just going to let you go. It doesn't change what's on the books. And what I do not care about is how the individuals like Job or some Israelite master actually ended up treating their slave. I care about what the perfect God of justice and truth and love and light directed, regulated, whatever word is going to be less offensive to you. He's stepping in and giving the law for it. It's like if we said it's wrong for people to kidnap children, and someone else said sometimes those kidnappers actually let their victims go. So what? It's seriously that ridiculous of a statement to me.
But for foreign slaves, it's not regulated every 7th year like this, as it was for Israelite servants.
Right, because it's for life.
All the servants and slaves had protections, had rights.
This, I think, is a very unfair thing to say. Did all servants, and again, this is debatable because he keeps using Exodus 21 as if it applies to foreign slaves, but even if it did, them having a right of some kind, like not getting a tooth knocked out or not being beaten to death, that's a right afforded to them on the books. That doesn't make it good. Again, I think that analogy here is so powerful to really understand this. If I somehow acquired 10 servants, I'm using all the best terminology here, but they were going to be property for life, which is what it says. And I had my 5 friends manage these 10, and I gave my 5 friends some rules. Hey, listen, this is my property, and as such, I want them treated in this way. I want to make sure that they each get a bath once a week because I don't want them to smell to me. I want to make sure that, punish them, do whatever you need to do, keep them in line, but don't let any of them die. Those are technically rights or laws afforded to those slaves. A certain condition of hygiene, not having their life taken from them. But so what? They're still a piece of property owned for life. They were still bought like a cow or a cart. This is not the defense that you think that it is.
None of these laws made a distinction between some kinds of slaves versus others.
Except going back to Leviticus 25:46, you can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Distinction, major distinction. One is owned for life, one has 7 years. One can be treated ruthlessly and one cannot. Come on, it's right here. So from here, he goes on to talk about sexual slavery, which I also have covered and will cover in my bigger slavery video. He goes on to talk about what the New Testament says about slavery. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. I wanted to focus in on how good-meaning, well-intended Christian apologists try to make excuses, read between the lines, ignore certain texts, put more emphasis on other texts, blur the lines here to make this thing that is obviously wrong somehow acceptable because it was better than some of what was going on elsewhere, not an excuse. Because they had some rights sometimes, not an excuse. Because you didn't have to kidnap them, you could just buy them or barter for them, not an excuse. And how I want to end today's video is his big statement throughout the course of a lot of this is not the same kind of thing as the chattel slavery we saw in the Americas. Let me show you very quickly a side-by-side comparison. So here we'll put the transatlantic slave trade, and here we'll put the biblical slavery of foreigners. Both involved the acquisition of people to own for life as property. Both acquired this property from outside of the dominant or in-group. Both were subjected to forced labor without consent. Both were exploited for economic gain. Both had a legally inferior status. Both involved the systematic breakup of families. Both entailed the master's legal right to abuse or beat their slaves. Both had religious or, at best, cultural justification. Both allowed generational inheritance, including children being born into slavery and thus perpetuating the cycle of slavery. I've already used this word, but both were clear that they were indeed the same as property, with a right to own them, a right to trade them, and a right to resell them. And lastly, although we could do so many more, both did indeed contain some kind of a racial or cultural or ethnic grouping. That does not equate racism per se, but the very distinction that the Israelites had better preferences for their own in servitude with a year of Jubilee after 7 years versus the ownership of foreign slaves for life is absolutely obvious according to the text and simply without excuse. I didn't stop to explain each of these, and I can hear pushback already, but I think that I've done a pretty good job so far in showing the verses and the context that make the things I just said airtight. We see 613 other laws on the books, many of which were completely cultural and of their time, that God had no problem saying, "Thou shalt not." And the truth of the matter and the simplicity of the matter is that God did not do this for owning another human being as property. I really believe the case is that cut and dry. That's all I have to say for this episode. Keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank all of my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Anne, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.